I know I'm just an old guy spinning tales, but some tales aren't meant to be ignored. Trust me, you'll want to hear this one. So turn down the lights, settle in, and let's dive into today's chilling stories. Before we begin, a fair warning. What you're about to hear is purely for entertainment. These stories and theories, they're nothing more than shadows in the dark. No proof, just whispers carried by the night. Listen closely, but don't say, "I didn't warn you." Viewer discretion is strongly advised. It started as a stupid game. It was a Friday night, and we were bored out of our minds. My best friend, Megan, had dragged me and two other friends, Chris and Julia, to her grandmother's old, creaky house. The place was practically falling apart, with its peeling wallpaper and cobwebbed corners. But Megan insisted it was full of character. After an hour of aimless chit-chat and scrolling through our phones, Megan grinned and pulled out a dusty box from under the couch. "Check this out," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. The box was old, its corners frayed, and across the top, faded letters read, "Spirit Board." Chris rolled his eyes. "You've got to be kidding me. A Ouija board? What are we, 12? Megan smirked. "Come on, don't be a coward. Let's make this night interesting." Julia hesitated, her eyes darting nervously toward the dimly lit hallway. "I don't think this is a good idea. My mom always said these things invite trouble." "Your mom also thinks crystals can heal broken bones," Megan shot back. "Relax, it's just a game." Reluctantly, we all sat around the coffee table while Megan set up the board. The planchette, a small wooden pointer, sat in the center, looking oddly innocent. "Okay," Megan said, placing her fingers lightly on the planchette. "Everyone ready?" Chris huffed. "This is so dumb." But he joined in anyway, his fingers brushing against the wood. Julia and I exchanged uneasy glances but followed suit. The air in the room felt heavier, like the old house itself was leaning in to listen. "Is there anyone here with us?" Megan asked, her voice dripping with theatricality. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the planchette moved, sliding slowly toward yes. Chris laughed nervously. "Okay, who's messing around?" "No one," Megan said, her voice serious now. "Swear on it." We all nodded, though I could feel the tension rising. Megan continued, her grin faltering slightly. "What's your name?" The planchette began to move again, faster this time. My stomach twisted as the letters spelled out ALICE. Julia gasped, pulling her hands away. "I don't like this," she whispered. "Come on, don't chicken out now," Megan said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Fine," Chris said, taking charge. "Alice, how did you die?" The planchette hesitated, then slid across the board with purpose. FIRE. A shiver ran down my spine. The house felt colder, the shadows in the room darker. "What do you want from us?" Megan asked, her voice quieter now. The planchette stopped in the middle of the board, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Just when I thought the game was over, it moved one last time. LEAVE. Julia shot to her feet, her eyes wide. "I told you this was a bad idea." Megan tried to laugh it off, but the unease was clear on her face. "It's just a prank. Probably some factory worker programmed the board to do this." "No one's programming a Ouija board, Megan," Julia snapped. "Fine," Megan said, rolling her eyes. "Let's say goodbye." We all placed our hands back on the planchette, moving it to the word goodbye. But as soon as we did, a loud bang echoed through the house. "What was that?" I whispered, my heart racing. Chris grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the hallway. The beam wavered, illuminating nothing but the peeling wallpaper and dust particles floating in the air. "It's an old house," Megan said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Probably the wind." But the windows were shut, and the air in the room was deathly still. Julia was already grabbing her coat. "I'm not staying here. You shouldn't either." None of us argued. We packed up the board and left Megan's grandmother's house, our laughter and bravado gone. But as I walked out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching us. Back at my apartment, I tried to push the night's events out of my mind. It was just a game, I told myself. Megan probably moved the planchette, or maybe Chris did. But when I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, I noticed something strange. The faint smell of smoke hung in the air, and the temperature in my room had dropped significantly. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. "Leave." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The whisper, faint but clear. "Leave." It wasn't a voice I recognized, and yet it felt familiar, like it was right next to me, just out of reach. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. I checked the windows, the vents, even the kitchen, but there was nothing. No fire, no reason for it to be there. By morning, the whispers had stopped, but the unease hadn't. I texted the group, needing to know if they'd experienced anything strange. Megan responded first, brushing it off. "Megan, you're just freaking yourself out. It's an old house. Relax." Chris was less dismissive. "Chris, I had a weird dream last night. There was this little girl, and she was crying, but it felt real, you know." And then Julia replied, her message short and chilling. "Julia, I don't want to talk about it. Don't text me again about this." By the time we met at the coffee shop that afternoon, the tension between us was palpable. Julia barely spoke, her eyes darting to the windows like she was waiting for something, or someone. Chris looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. And Megan, for all her bravado, couldn't quite meet anyone's gaze. "I think we need to figure out what's going on," I said, breaking the silence. Megan scoffed. "What's going on is that we scared ourselves. That's it." "Then how do you explain the dreams? The whispers?" I asked, leaning forward. Megan shrugged. "Coincidence. Our brains are just messing with us." "Then why are you acting so weird?" Julia snapped, her voice trembling. "You're not fine, Megan. None of us are." Chris, who had been unusually quiet, pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and slid it across the table. "I found this online," he said. The paper was a printout of an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Tragic fire claims young girl's life in local home." I scanned the article, my stomach sinking. The details were vague, but the address was clear. Megan's grandmother's house. "Her name was Alice," Chris said, his voice low. Julia paled, pushing her chair back. "We need to stop. Right now, we shouldn't be talking about this." But Megan grabbed the paper, her eyes narrowing. "This doesn't mean anything. It's just some stupid coincidence." That night, the knocking started. I was lying in bed, the glow of my phone illuminating the dark room, when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks on my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was my roommate, but when I called out, there was no response. "Sarah?" I said, my voice trembling. Nothing. I got up, my heart pounding, and opened the door. The hallway was empty, the faint smell of smoke wafting through the air. As I turned to go back to bed, I saw it. A single handprint on the wall, small and faint, as if it had been left by a child. The next day, we gathered at Megan's house. Chris arrived with fresh scratches on his arm, claiming he'd woken up to the sensation of nails dragging across his skin. Julia hadn't slept at all, dark circles etched under her eyes. "We made contact with something," Chris said, his voice shaky, "and it's not just going to go away." Megan rolled her eyes, though her hands trembled as she poured coffee. "You're all being ridiculous. It's in your heads." "It's not," Julia said quietly. "I saw her last night in my mirror." Everyone froze. She was just standing there, watching me. Julia's voice cracked, and she said my name. We decided to return to Megan's grandmother's house, desperate for answers. The Ouija board was still there, tucked away in the corner of the living room. "I don't think we should do this," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to," Chris insisted. "We need to end this." Reluctantly, we all sat around the board again. Megan lit a single candle, its flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. "Are you here?" Megan asked, her voice trembling. The planchette didn't move. "Did we disturb you?" Chris added, his hands shaking as they rested on the board. The planchette slid to yes. Megan hesitated, her bravado cracking. "What do you want from us?" The planchette moved quickly now, the letters spelling out LEAVE. The candle flickered violently, and the air in the room grew colder. Julia sobbed, pulling her hands away from the board. "We shouldn't have done this. We need to leave." But before anyone could move, the planchette moved one last time, spelling out a chilling message. Too late. The moment the planchette spelled out "too late," the candle extinguished itself. The room was plunged into darkness, but the air wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, alive with a presence none of us could see but all of us could feel. Julia screamed, scrambling away from the table. Chris grabbed his phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the room, revealing the Ouija board still sitting on the table. The planchette had moved again, though none of us had touched it. It now pointed to the word goodbye. "Enough," Megan said, her voice trembling. "We're done. Let's go." We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted for the door, but as we reached the hallway, it slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. "Megan, open it!" I shouted, panic rising. "I'm trying!" she yelled, yanking at the handle. But it wouldn't budge. Behind us, the sound of something scraping against the floor echoed through the house. Slowly, we turned to see the source. The table we'd been sitting at was moving, dragging itself across the room, the Ouija board still resting on top. And then, faint but unmistakable, we heard it. A child's laughter, soft and chilling. The lights in the hallway flickered as Megan finally threw the door open. We stumbled outside, gasping for air. The night was eerily silent, the stars hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. Julia was the first to speak. "She doesn't want us to leave." "We're already outside," Megan snapped. "It's over." "No, it's not," Chris muttered, holding up his arm. Scratches crisscrossed his skin, fresh and bleeding. "This isn't over." I glanced back at the house, and my blood ran cold. In the second-floor window, a pale face stared back at us, unmoving. It was a little girl, her features smooth and blank, like she wasn't fully real. She raised one hand and pointed directly at me. That night, Julia disappeared. She didn't answer her phone, didn't respond to texts, and when we went to her apartment the next morning, the door was unlocked. Her keys and phone were still on the counter, her car parked outside. but she was gone. Her mirror, however, was cracked. A single word scrawled across the glass in what looked like ash. Mine. After Julia's disappearance, the haunting escalated. Chris started waking up with bruises, his arms and legs covered in dark, hand-shaped marks. Megan's house was filled with the smell of smoke, no matter how much she aired it out. And me? I started hearing the laughter. It followed me everywhere, at work, in the car, even in my own home. A soft, girlish giggle echoing just behind me, no matter where I went. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. My mirror had fogged over, like someone had breathed on it. Scrawled across the glass in faint letters were the words, "Come back." "We have to go back," I said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Chris sat in the passenger seat, his face pale. "Are you insane? That's exactly what it wants." "It already has, Julia," I snapped. "What if it takes one of us next? We have to end this." Megan was silent in the back seat, staring out the window. She hadn't been the same since Julia disappeared. Jumpy, withdrawn, like she was constantly on the verge of tears. "You think we can fight something like this?" she whispered. "We don't even know what it is." "We don't have a choice," I said, starting the car. When we reached the house, the air felt different, colder, heavier. The shadows in the windows seemed to move, shifting unnaturally as we approached. Chris hesitated at the front door, his hand hovering over the handle. "If we go in, we might not come out." "We don't have a choice," I repeated, my voice firm. The Ouija board was still on the table, the planchette resting in the center. The house was unnervingly quiet, the air thick with the smell of smoke, and something else, something metallic, like blood. We gathered around the table, just like before. This time, it was Megan who spoke first. "Alice," she said, her voice trembling, "what do you want from us?" The planchette moved instantly, faster than it ever had before. "YOU." The temperature in the room plummeted, and the lights flickered violently. Shadows began to gather in the corners, twisting and writhing like living things. "Why are you doing this?" Chris shouted. The board responded, spelling out a chilling message. "I burned. You will too." The shadows surged forward, and the candle Megan had lit earlier flared to life, its flame unnaturally high and bright. The walls seemed to close in around us, the air thick with heat and smoke. "Say goodbye," I screamed, grabbing the planchette. But it wouldn't move. The laughter returned, louder now, echoing from every direction. The shadows formed a shape, a small girl, her face burned and twisted, her eyes black pits of hatred. "You took everything from me," she hissed, her voice layered with pain and fury. "Now I'll take everything from you." The shadows surged, swallowing the room in darkness. The little girl's twisted form flickered in and out of the gloom, her blackened eyes burning into us. The temperature plummeted, and every breath felt like ice slicing through my lungs. "Say goodbye!" I shouted again, gripping the planchette with trembling hands. "It's not working!" Chris yelled, his voice cracking with fear. The planchette wouldn't budge. It felt glued to the board, as if the spirit itself was holding it in place. The laughter returned, louder and sharper, echoing from every corner of the room. Megan screamed as the shadows reached for her, icy tendrils wrapping around her wrists and ankles. "It's pulling me!" she shrieked, clawing at the table. "Alice, stop!" I shouted. "We didn't mean to disturb you." The air seemed to crackle with anger, and the planchette jerked violently across the board, spelling out a single word: "Liars." The candle on the table flared again, its flame a sickly green. The room filled with the smell of smoke and burning flesh, and in the shadows, I saw her, Alice. Her small frame was burned and broken, her face twisted into a mask of rage. She stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. "You didn't listen," she hissed, her voice layered with pain and fury. "Now you'll feel what I felt." Chris fumbled through his backpack, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. "I found this online," he shouted, thrusting it toward me. I grabbed it, scanning the hastily printed words. It was a ritual, a banishment spell meant to sever ties with lingering spirits. "It's our only chance," Chris said, lighting another candle with shaking hands. The shadows recoiled slightly, as if sensing what we were about to do. Alice's form twisted violently, her blackened eyes narrowing. "No," she growled, her voice deep and guttural. "You can't send me back." I began reciting the words on the page, my voice trembling but steady. Chris and Megan joined in, their voices rising above the growing roar of the shadows. "Spirit of the lost, bound by pain and fury, we release you. Depart this plane and find your rest," Alice screamed, the sound inhuman and deafening. The shadows lashed out, slamming into the walls and ceiling, shaking the entire house. The flame on the candle wavered but didn't go out. "Keep going!" Chris shouted. "We sever the bond. We undo the pact. Return to the darkness from which you came," I yelled, my voice cracking. Alice's form flickered, her twisted figure shaking violently. "You can't send me away," she screamed, her voice layered with the cries of dozens of others. "I am part of you now." The room exploded with light as the candle's flame shot skyward, illuminating every corner. For a brief moment, I saw them, the faces of others like Alice, burned, broken, trapped in the shadows. Their eyes locked on me, filled with anger and despair. And then they were gone. The shadows retreated, the air lightening as the oppressive weight lifted. The house fell silent, the smell of smoke dissipating. We sat there in stunned silence, the Ouija board lying shattered on the floor. The planchette had cracked in half, the edges charred black. Did it work?" Megan whispered, her voice hoarse. Chris looked around, his eyes wide and fearful. "I think so." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, I returned home, exhausted but hopeful. As I stepped into my apartment, the air felt normal, light, breathable. For the first time in days, I thought we might be free. I collapsed onto my bed, closing my eyes. And then I heard it. A faint giggle, soft and chilling, coming from the corner of the room. When I turned, the mirror was fogged over. The word "stay" scrawled across the glass in ash. The word "stay" stared back at me, scrawled across the mirror in thick, dark ash. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The air in the room grew colder, and the faint giggle I'd heard before now echoed louder, bouncing off the walls. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "We ended it. You're gone." But deep down, I knew. Alice wasn't gone. She had never left. I turned on every light in the apartment, hoping to chase away the growing darkness. But no matter how bright the bulbs glowed, the shadows seemed thicker, heavier, clinging to the corners like living things. My phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. It was a message from Megan. "Megan, I can't sleep. It's still here. I can feel it." I texted back, my fingers trembling. "What do you mean?" "We ended it." Her response came immediately. "Megan, come over. Please." I didn't want to go, but I couldn't leave her alone. The streets were eerily quiet as I drove. The usual hum of the city replaced by an oppressive stillness. When I reached Megan's house, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Smoke. Faint, but unmistakable. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. "Megan," I called out, pushing the door open. The house was dark, the faint glow of the street lights barely illuminating the living room. "Megan!" I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her back to me. Her head was bowed, her shoulders shaking. "Megan, are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. She didn't respond. The closer I got, the more I realized something was wrong. The air around her was unnaturally cold, and her hair hung limp, damp with sweat. I reached out to touch her shoulder. "Megan!" She turned suddenly, her face pale and streaked with tears. "She's still here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She won't leave me alone." Before I could respond, the shadows in the room shifted, pooling together in the corner. Slowly they rose, forming the outline of a small figure. Alice. Her burned face twisted into a cruel smile, her hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You can't get rid of me," she hissed. "I told you. It's too late." Megan screamed, knocking her chair over as she stumbled back. "What do you want?" she cried, her voice breaking. Alice's form flickered, growing taller, more menacing. "You brought me back," she said, her voice layered with fury. "Now I want what's mine." "What does that mean?" I shouted, stepping between Alice and Megan. Alice tilted her head, her charred lips curling into a smirk. "One of you stays, that's the deal. The rest can go." "No!" Megan screamed. "We didn't agree to that." "You made the first move," Alice snapped. "You opened the door. Now one of you will close it, forever." The shadows in the room grew thicker, suffocating. Megan clung to my arm, her body trembling violently. "We can't let her win," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But how do we stop her?" Megan sobbed. Alice laughed, the sound sharp and hollow. "You don't. Choose, or I'll choose for you." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. The air was thick with fear, the smell of smoke choking me. "I'll stay," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Megan's head snapped toward me. "What? No?" "It's the only way," I said, stepping forward. "If I stay, she'll let you go. You can have a life, Megan. Please?" Alice's form twisted, her smile widening. "A noble choice," she said mockingly. "But are you sure?" "Yes," I said firmly. "Take me." The shadows surged forward, enveloping me. The air turned icy, and for a moment, I thought I'd suffocate. But then everything went still. When I opened my eyes, I was back in Megan's house, but it was empty. The lights were off, the furniture gone, the walls bare. I stepped outside, but the street was different, silent, lifeless. The sky above was an endless gray, and the air was heavy with the smell of smoke. I turned to look at Megan's house, but it wasn't there. Instead, I stood in front of a burned-out shell of a building, its charred beams reaching toward the sky like broken fingers. A soft giggle echoed behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. Alice stood there, her form flickering in and out of focus. "Welcome home," she said, her voice dripping with malice. Meanwhile, Megan woke up in her room, gasping for air. The shadows in her home were gone, the smell of smoke dissipated, but on her phone, a single message appeared. "It's not over." Megan stared at her phone, the message glaring back at her. "It's not over." Her chest tightened, and her hands shook as she typed a reply, even though she knew she wouldn't get one. "Who is this? What do you want?" The message sent, but there was no response. The shadows in her room seemed to shift, and the faintest smell of smoke drifted through the air. "Stop it," she whispered, hugging herself tightly. "It's over. You're gone." But deep down, she knew the truth. Alice wasn't done. The following days were a blur. Megan tried to resume her life, but guilt gnawed at her. She hadn't heard from Chris since that night, and the thought of what had happened to me haunted her. She returned to the coffee shop where we'd first met to discuss the board. The place felt wrong now, too quiet, too bright, as if the world itself was pretending everything was fine. While she stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, she noticed a woman at a nearby table staring at her. The woman's eyes were sharp, unblinking. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Megan leaned closer, trying to make out what she was saying. The woman mouthed the words, "Don't look away." Megan blinked, and the woman was gone. Her cup of coffee sat untouched on the table, the faint smell of smoke curling up from its surface. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled out of the cafe, her heart racing. The shadows on the street seemed darker, the light less forgiving. And then her phone buzzed again. "Come back to me." Later that night, Megan's phone rang. The screen showed Chris's name, and for a brief moment, relief washed over her. "Chris," she said, answering quickly. "Where have you been?" His voice was faint, distant. "Megan, it's not over. She's stronger now. She's using us." "What are you talking about?" Megan asked, her stomach twisting. "The pact," Chris said, his voice trembling. "It didn't end with—" The line went dead, cutting off his words. Megan called back, but the number was disconnected. That night, Megan dreamed of Alice. In the dream, she stood in the burned-out remains of the house, the walls blackened and crumbling. Alice was there, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You left him," Alice said, her voice soft but sharp. "You didn't stay." Megan tried to speak, but her throat felt tight, her voice swallowed by the oppressive air. "You'll come back," Alice said, her burned face splitting into a cruel smile. "You all will." When Megan woke up, her mirror was cracked, and the word "return" was scrawled in ash across the surface. Megan knew she couldn't run anymore. She had to end it. Gathering her courage, she drove to Chris's apartment, hoping he could help. But when she arrived, the door was ajar, and the smell of smoke was overwhelming. "Chris," she called, stepping inside. The apartment was empty, but on the floor, a single item lay untouched: a photograph of the four of us from that night at Megan's grandmother's house. The faces in the photo were scratched out, except for Alice's. "She's not going to stop," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. Desperate, Megan returned to the burned-out remains of her grandmother's house. The night was eerily silent, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and ash. Standing in the center of the ruins, Megan called out, "Alice, I'm here!" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the shadows began to move, twisting and writhing as Alice's form emerged. "You came back," Alice said, her voice low and venomous. "I want to end this," Megan said, her hands trembling. "What do you want?" Alice's blackened eyes burned with fury. "I want what was taken from me. I want all of you." The shadows surged forward, and Megan fell to her knees, the weight of Alice's presence pressing down on her. "What if I stay?" Megan whispered. "What if I give myself to you? Will you let the others go?" Alice tilted her head, considering the offer. "Would you?" Megan nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, just let them go. Let them be free." Alice's form flickered, her twisted smile widening. Then we have a deal. The shadows enveloped Megan, and for a moment the air was filled with the sound of crackling fire and faint laughter. When the light returned, Megan was gone. Chris woke up in his apartment, gasping for air. The smell of smoke was gone, and the oppressive weight had lifted. For the first time in days, the air felt normal. But on his phone was a single message from Megan. "It's done. You're free." Relief washed over him, but as he stood and walked to the mirror, his heart froze. In the reflection, behind him, stood Alice. Her blackened eyes locked onto his. She smiled,